Good evening, everyone. From us, the scribblers of sinister, I think that's what I love to call ourselves. And kicking off a session on crime writing feels a bit like stepping into a smoky, dark alley where everyone has secrets. And we have some incredible acclaimed writers of Noir, and hopefully we'll uncover some of those secrets. So let's get dark, but not so dark. It's still a sunny day. All of us here delve into crime writing, noir fiction as we call it. As someone who just dipped into the genre myself with my first crime novel, I'm first very curious to know, and I would like to know your quick thoughts about what do you think when you hear noir? What do you picture? Do you picture rain-soaked streets, brooding detectives, or just your last deadline? What does noir mean to you really?
It's good that you used the word picture, because noir is, of course, a cinematic term, and it stems from the 1940s Hollywood movies that had their roots in German expressionism. And I think a great example, and also one of the greatest movies of all time, is The Third Man, which began as a movie and was made into a novel. So the transition goes from cinema into literature. So it was, of course, a brilliant 1949 film starring Orson Welles, directed by Carol Reed, and then made into a novel by Graham Greene. And I think it contains everything, really, that we're talking about: the shadows, the moral ambiguity, and also not just the morally ambiguous characters, but the very, very dark themes that sit behind them. And I quite like that the direction of travel was from cinema into literature, because that's a slight inversion of its traditional of how narratives often go. But yes, that would be mine, definitely. Moral ambiguity and shadowy darkness was the first thing that I would think of.
Ram, what draws you to this twisted little genre?
So, similarly to B, I think of it as very much of that period in time, sort of The Big Sleep and things like that. I see it as very spare and but one of the things that I feel like, at least I've tried to do with my book, is I see noir as being a little bit humorless, or being a little bit or just having maybe like a very dark humor. And I actually think that you can do a lot of things with noir and actually have something quite light. But for me, the definition of noir is something that even in lightness continues to have an atmosphere of menace.
Moral ambiguity, humor.
Sorry.
Vaseem,
James Ellroy wrote that noir, the definition of noir is doom, but made fun.
Made fun, yeah. Humor. Vaseem, your take.
Well, before I answer it, I just want to say how nice it is to be back at the JLF. I was born here and I grew up in this country, but in my 20s I got the opportunity to go and live in India for a decade. I'm watching this country transform into the near superpower that we think of India as today. And I loved it so much I married an Indian and dragged her back to this country 18 years ago, and she still hasn't forgiven me. I don't get the chance to go back so often anymore, but she asked me to go back every year because she's got family there. And I always reply, tongue-in-cheek, that I'm quite happy having 4,000 miles between myself and my mother-in-law. It's a joke. I love my mother-in-law. So it's lovely that the JLF do the job for me by bringing India to me every year. So I've been writing crime for a very long time. I've got 11 crime novels out over the last 11 years. I teach crime writing. I'm the chair of the Crime Writers Association, the oldest association of crime writers. And what I understand more than anything else over all of these years is that it's such a broad church. There is no one way. There's no one definition of what noir means to any one individual. You could capture all of it with one sentiment, in my experience, and that is this: that people all around the world, all cultures, all generations, no matter how urbane, how genteel, they love to see other people being murdered in fiction. And you'll be amazed. A lot of my readers are, I go to sort of all over the place to do talks, and I'll go to some village in the middle of England, and it'll be an audience of 80 elderly women, all of whom are the most genteel-looking people that you can possibly imagine, and yet they absolutely love to see brutal slayings on the page. And a lot of it is the golden age tradition from Agatha Christie's time, but a lot of that's been transplanted to the modern era. So for me, I think it's just that simple fact that all of us have that titillation towards seeing crime narratives.
And
in
you
fiction.
specifically said women.
Well, a lot of my readers are, well, if you look across fiction, if you know anything about the publishing industry, 60 to 70% of readers are women. And in crime fiction particularly, that probably rises towards 70, 75%. That's just a fact.
Fascinating. So, B, your fabulous debut novel, One Woman Crime Wave, and I've read it, it's amazing. It's about neighborhood's favorite babysitter who loves gathering information about the families that she babysits for. There's a sharp wit mixed with social commentary, which is an underlying theme. Was this novel born from personal experience, one, and should your neighbors be worried? Tell us about the original.
I have it on reliable intel that I will never be invited to another dinner party because there are some fairly excruciating dinner party scenes. It's not based on personal experience, although I am a very nosy person and I kind of celebrate nosiness. Curiosity if you want to be more elegant. But I sometimes pose this question to an audience that if you go to someone's house and you go to the bathroom and you go in and lock the door, go to the toilet, wash your hands, and open the cupboard above the sink, because the mirror is a cupboard, and look inside. Is it just me? I know it's not just me.
It's just you.
It's not just
just
me.
you.
Do you have a little look inside if you're inside? See? Do you look inside? Do you poke behind the boring shampoo and, there's that sort of sordid curiosity that makes you want to know what's in there, if we're honest. And I wanted to push that to an almost disgusting extreme and just make people feel very uncomfortable.
I hope your neighbors have curtains.
Vaseem, 5 novels of your famous Malabar House series, and we were talking about it, have explored colonial Bombay, which I find really interesting. And we're talking about 1950 and 51 specifically. And now with your new novel, The Girl in Celé, you have crossed continents to small town America. Vaseem, have you run out of darkness in the UK one? And to tell us about this journey from Bombay to the US and how much does place shape the crime and characters and criminals?
Well, if I try to answer all of those questions, I'd end up talking for too long. So what I'll do is for now, I'll just focus on the Malabar House novels, and maybe we can come back to one of them so that I don't hog the limelight. So the Malabar House novels, for those who don't know, this is the first one, Midnight at Malabar House. So I'd lived in India for a decade. I wrote one series which is set in modern Mumbai. They're called the Baby Ganesh series, about a middle-aged policeman named Inspector Chopra, who retires in his mid-40s in Bombay, or Mumbai as it's now known, obviously. And then he has to solve a murder, but he also inherits a baby elephant, which, if someone hands you a baby elephant and you live in Mumbai on the 13th floor of a tower block, what do you do with it? So that became the conceit for that book. I never expected it to be published. I never expected to end up on the BBC sofa talking about it to millions of people, and it basically gave me a career. But once I'd written 5 books in that series, looking at modern India, I wanted to know where this India came from. And although it's a country that's thousands of years old, the modern India that we see today, it very much is a function of a mix between the legacy of Indian history and the legacy that the British left after being in India for 300 years. So that's why I chose to look at 1950, which is just 3 years after Indian independence, the assassination of Gandhi and the horrors of partition still hanging over the country. And into this mix, into this turbulent period, I introduced India's first female police detective, Persis. She qualifies, nobody knows what to do with her, so they put her in Bombay's smallest police station in Malabar House, in Malabar Hill in Bombay, and they put her with a whole bunch of other rejects and misfits that nobody wants to work with. And then a body lands in her lap, and she has to investigate in the company of an Englishman who has come out to help the Bombay service set up its own forensic science service. And these books are really about exploring the end of the Raj and what India did next. How did India, which was the world's largest democracy at the time, 300 million Indians, and there's 1.5 billion now, so they've obviously been very busy over the last 70 years. What did they do? How did they react to getting the reins of their own country back? And how did they respond? And I just use these mysteries as a vehicle to explore that incredibly that period that I wish that I had been taught about growing up in this country, and I never was. And I loved history, and I loved the world, learning about the world wars and Tudor England. I loved all of that. But I wish that I had learned a little bit about the history of my heritage on the subcontinent, and that's what these books try to do.
Amazing. And Ram, your debut novel is also set in India. And before that, I think you worked in law and entertainment, that is TV, which sounds suspiciously close to a noir setup. But Death in the Air, which is your first novel, is based in India in a spa resort in Rishikesh. One, after juggling law, film, and TV, what made you decide to add crime novelist to your resume? And how do your different worlds shape the suspense and social layers in Death in the Air?
Well, yeah, once again, it's a lot of questions at once, so I'll try to answer succinctly. I mean, I never had any intention of ever being a writer in my life. I never wrote a word of fiction. And I happened to be in India at a hotel near Rishikesh, and while I was there, I just couldn't stop thinking about what a great setting it would be for an Agatha Christie-style mystery novel. And then I just had the idea in my head for a year, and then I went off and wrote it, and here we are. So I know it's a very unlikely story for a lot of writers, but I came to it from a very different point of view from Vaseem. I mean, I'm obviously Indian, but I was born in the States. I spent almost no time in India growing up whatsoever. I mean, when I went to India on the trip where I had the idea for the book, it was maybe my 5th trip to India ever, and I was 40 years old. So I knew that I was writing about India as a foreigner. And what that meant was I was very conscious of the stories that I felt it was appropriate for me to tell or not. And I actually made the conscious decision to tell a story about what I thought about India just now. And a corollary to that is that my father always said that he thought the West was obsessed with making India look dirty and poor. And the more I saw representations of India in Western culture, the more I really thought he had a point. So I decided to write in India where everything was glamorous, everybody was rich, and India had like the extent of the wealth and the glamour that I know that it has. And part of that, as a conscious decision, was I do not mention colonialism once in the book because I do not want to acknowledge for 1 second the fact that anyone could have even thought that Indians were ever inferior.
Great. Like you talked about colonialism, and Wasim's novel are based in the 1950s. And B, you talk a lot about class bias in your story. A question to all of you: how political is crime writing? I think it's more than murders and blood and gore. I think how political is crime?
I mean, of course, you can tell by our answers show that everyone's got an itch to scratch. And so that's what I love about fiction, because there's the story and there's the story behind the story. And in particular with crime, because I think we're here in a session called Noir. I'm not sure that the increasingly diminutive labels that are attached to genre are very helpful. They're just a marketing device, and they're quite a sort of modern confection in a way. It's just either a great story or not. All the way back in time. That's what humans crave. But what I love about crime is, did you just say it was like a vehicle for? Yes. Yeah. So, and if there is something that's, and this is something about writing fiction, which I'm quite new to, but it's really bloody hard work. And so there has to be a compulsion. There has to be something that's kind of scratching its way out of you. And so for me, it was the story of social inequality in this immediate neighborhood. So where we are in London, in the splendors of the British Library, this is the London borough of Camden, which contains Hampstead and lots of billionaires, and it also contains 30%, 30, child poverty. So there's pockets of real hardship right here. I mean, just a stone's throw from the British Library. And I wanted to look at how uncomfortable British people are with the proximity of poor people, and what lengths they'll go to kind of distance themselves. And I wanted to go straight into something that is very uncomfortable. We've sort of come a long way, arguably not far enough, talking about race, about sexism, about all other forms of discrimination, but class is still the most problematic and the most uncomfortable, certainly for British people. So I wanted to write something that confronted that and was not easy. And I also love very much the idea of capturing a moment of social conflict. So I set in the time of 2012, which for anyone that was in London in that halcyon summer of the London Olympics when it was still cool to wave a flag and everyone kind of loved each other. And, you know, it was the only time that Britain was cool ever, before or since. And, you know, even at that point, the seeds of the subsequent social division were very much there. So that's why I set it in that particular time. And then I wanted to look at how a close-knit community can sort of cleave apart.
Ram, you want to add something?
So I had a lot of very similar thoughts. I mean, it's funny because when I had my first meeting with my agent about my book, what I said was I was basically trying to hide the vegetables by making it a mystery novel. I mean, I had more serious themes that I wanted to address, but I also, it was my first book, I didn't have any confidence that I would ever write anything that anybody would want to read. I was like, the best way to do that is just to disguise it as a murder mystery. So I wrote a murder mystery. But for me, really a huge part of it was kind of trying to reshuffle the way I see Indians as perceived socially and in social strata, and I wanted just to put the Indians on top the whole time. And something one of the first scenes I wrote in the book, just because I'd never seen it anywhere, I have an Indian person calling a white person white trash on like page 6 of the book. Just because I'd never seen that anywhere, and I wanted to do it.
Yeah, and Vaseem, you mentioned assassination of Gandhi, partition of India, you know, formation of Pakistan, all huge events in the subcontinent, South Asia, at the time where your novels are based.
Well, for me, I don't think that history and politics, I think, cannot be disassociated from each other. Yeah. Certainly not in the era that I'm writing about, in 1950s India. And one of the things that I learned, and why I like writing about this period in particular, and I didn't learn this until I did the research, is that contrary to what I believed before I went to India, not all the British left in 1947. There were tens and thousands of Brits that remained in India. And they remained because they had either been born there, they had businesses there, or they couldn't stomach the idea of coming back to cold, wet, miserable England. And because of that, there was a hangover of empire that lasted for a couple of decades into that period. And I think you've all heard the saying, the sun never sets on the British Empire. And I think Gandhi famously quipped, that's because God doesn't trust the British in the dark. And for me, it's embedded in all of these books. So in Midnight at Malabar House, the first book, the murder victim is a British diplomat. I have to be honest, I do kill a lot of white people in these books, but that's fair enough exchange, I think, for 300 years of colonialism. And I also use a lot of dry humor, because what I'm trying to do with these books is provide a balanced perspective. I grew up in the UK, learning about India through white historians. Nothing wrong with that. Lots of my research is through the eyes of white historians who've written about India of those periods. But once I started doing the research, there's lots of modern Indian historians who have written about that period, and also the first-person narratives, which are now available on places like Facebook. There's a group called Old Bombay, which is amazing. That Old Bombay group, if you want to know what Bombay was like throughout the last century, it's an amazing place to go. And I always say this when I do these talks, that not every Brit in India was a sinner, and not every Indian was a saint. And what I mean by that is that many of the Brits that went out during the Raj went out because they were told that this is a way to make a living, especially in the Indian civil service. And not every Indian was a saint, because when it came to partition, it was 1 million Indians who killed each other, Muslims, Hindus, and Sikhs. You know, obviously the British were culpable in it to a certain extent. So I think we have to be quite balanced when we look at history, and that's what I think my books try to do within the setting of crime narrative.
Yeah, it is essentially political. Also, I would like to share that when I started writing my first crime fiction, I was looking at a period of 1990s, and the event that kicked in the entire story was Babri demolition. And around there, a lot of Islamophobia, and it's about a cop who is a homophobic cop, who is after his own son. So murders do happen, there are men thrown in the story, but there's a lot of politics and happening. You can't get away with the events surrounding the story.
But to me, very quickly, I'll just say that the most amazing thing to me when I went to India, because I didn't know anything about it. I was age 23, I'd never been, and whatever I learned from India was some handed down stories from my dad, but he was a child when partition happened, and Bollywood films. And of course, they, as you know, they don't really bear much relationship to reality. But I was taken there by my boss, who was a snowy-haired guy from Kent. His name was Terry Brewer. And after a few months, he came to me and took me in a corner. He said, Vaz, I'm really worried about these Indians. I said, well, Terry, what's the problem? What have they done to you? He said, they're always so happy to see me. Don't they know what my ancestors did here? And, he was saying it tongue in cheek, but I think he was taken aback by the hospitality and the kindness and the way that Indians were willing to welcome people from all around the world, but especially Brits, because they're too busy looking forward, the way that Ram is describing. They're too busy talking about their success so that they don't quite dwell on the past anymore.
But I just want to add with that is that I always say that India plays the long game. It's like we allowed colonialism because now look at the US and the UK. We colonized them. We run every big company in the US. We're at the top of everything. We just played the long game.
Can I just add to your point about crime writing being political? I think it's just such a superb vehicle for, and almost acts as a barometer of our times, because I've had a problem in the past with how crime has been construed and how women are construed in crime, particularly with the old hard-boiled detective and the femme fatale tropes, which are very much of their time. And then you've got writers coming along like Kia Abdullah, like Val McDermott, brilliant writers challenging many stereotypes, all the way down to microaggressions. And so, wave upon wave of people have taken this format, if you will, of, a dead body, if there has to be a dead body. I'm not sure that there does have to be a dead body. I'm quite interested in the area of where is crime not crime, what is that spectrum? But that people have made it their own, and people have actually been very subversive around those tropes, and that's definitely something to be celebrated.
And talking about your book, B, it is from the point of view of a teenage girl who can't stop stealing. You write, your protagonist, she thinks, they would probably think she was trying to be Robin Hood, stealing from the rich to give to the poor. No, they had no idea. That was so basic. How about forget the poor and infiltrate the rich, penetrate them, eat them from the inside? So there is a darkness and a sharp take on unequal society, and that theme runs throughout your story. When you started, you wanted it to have a social theme with a thriller crime angle?
Yes, but I wanted it to be sort of shot through with teenage girl fury, because, we've only seen just recently Greta Thunberg saying we need more angry young women in this world of ours. Look at the mess. So, and I think that young women who are, I remember being 15 and I remember being incandescent with rage, and it was quite diffuse and not necessarily negative, and yet, terrible oppressions happen to her. There's a lot of obstacles in her path, not just the fact that she's socially disadvantaged, economically disadvantaged, but street harassment, all of the shit that happens to her has happened to me personally. That's all verbatim. And so she channels that. And the journey that she's on is one of realization of how much the odds are stacked against her. She's very clever, but other people in this typical London neighborhood with, big houses with posh big windows, and people who give all their opportunities to their children at the expense of the poorer kids next door is what dawns upon her in that journey.
That brings me to the topic of our session, which is the craft of noir. What is the craft of crafting a noir? Can we discuss that? Suspense tropes, unlikable alcoholic, morally ambiguous protagonist that makes the reader root for them. These are the characters that appears almost in every crime novel. You can change the tropes, but one thing or the other, or one character or the other, they are there. That template is always there. Is there a way to do away with that template and create something very new? What is really the craft of crafting a noir? And this is a question to all of you.
Ron, you want to take it first?
Well, just sort of off the cuff, I think if you are sort of writing in a genre, you do have to stick to some of the tropes of that genre, both to honor the genre and to make sure the reader is satisfied. But I think it's almost like being an audio engineer, and it's deciding kind of what parts of it you want to turn up and what parts of it you want to turn down. I think one of the things that I really tried to do in my book is, India has a very different idea of death from what the West has. And the main character's father says to him in my book, life is cheap in India, easy come, easy go. And it's just one of the things. Death is not considered to be as big of a deal. And also a question I raise in my book has a lot of spiritual elements. And the spiritual elements are not necessarily pro-human. I mean, do some people just deserve to die? Do people deserve to die because of karma from a past life? Do people deserve to die from things their ancestors may have done? And in the end, what is justice? Is the person who actually maybe killed that person, is that the person who really should be punished for it? Or does someone else get punished for it? So I think it's about choosing what parts of the tropes you represent faithfully and choosing which ones you want to play with.
See, I disagree. I think I don't respect the rules of the genre. But then again, we have the chair of the Crime Writers Association. Agatha Christie famously wrote some rules: no mumbo jumbo, no feminine intuition. Yeah, probably. Okay. How rule-bound should it be? I think you're right that there's an audience expectation of some sense of justice being seen to be done. But I'm interested in,
Yeah, Mr. Khan.
All right.
Mr. Crime.
So I think the first assignment for any author is to have a clarity of purpose. What is it that you're trying to say with your story, and how do you want your readers to feel with that type of book? If you read a Jack Reacher thriller, it's a completely different reading, feeling, and set of emotions that you feel compared to reading, say, an Agatha Christie novel. If you read one of my books, they're written in a traditional style. They're about the place, they're about the characters, they're about the history that I'm seeking to hopefully impart to you so that you learn something interesting along the journey. But they're also primarily about the intellectual challenge.
Yeah.
All right, I use a lot of cryptic clues, and I hope that I throw the gauntlet down at the beginning of the book with the murder and some clues, and by the end of the book, if I've done my job right, you should be able to guess the murderer if you're an experienced reader, but then hopefully I've misdirected you to an extent where you don't. And so that's the payoff for you, and it's the payoff for me. So I think it's that clarity of purpose, that mission that you have, that is the first and primary rule for writing any type of crime fiction.
But you've talked about Jack Reacher novels and Agatha Christie, which, we're really talking about dark, noir fiction. Can there be a happy noir fiction novel? Happy where, what I mean by that, by the end of each noir novel, a case is solved, the murderer is arrested or killed, but still, by the end of it, and when you are finished reading that novel, there is so much darkness. Can there be a happy noir novel?
Well, I've alluded previously to the propensity of little old ladies to quite enjoy lots of murder. I think the beauty of most crime novels is this, that you set good against bad, and by the end of it, there's a resolution. The bad guys normally don't get away. In real life, they do often, but in these books, they don't get away. And that means for us as readers, we have a nice resolution at the end of it. That doesn't mean you can't make important points and talk about the slipperiness of politics and history and all of the other amazing things that go into this soup that we write about.
Can there be a happy ending in those novels?
I agree there has to be a sense of justice, but that it can't be too tidy or necessarily what's expected. So I sort of wanted to push back against some of the ideas of the rules. I wasn't sure whether if there's no dead body, does it still count as crime?
Yeah,
what constitutes a crime?
Yeah.
These are things
it
that I
could
wanted
be
to...
psychological, like in your book.
So actually, what I think about when I hear that question is not a book, it's a movie. It's Lars von Trier's Dogville, which I don't know if anybody has seen, but it's this movie. It's a very strange movie. It's basically filmed on a soundstage, but as if it's real locations. And Nicole Kidman plays this woman who comes to town basically with nothing. She's running away from something, and she throws herself on the mercy of the town. And it all starts out very beautifully, and she becomes accepted as part of the community and whatever else. But slowly and slowly, she gets more and more just sort of degraded and humiliated by everyone in the community, and basically almost like turns into a slave. And it just basically shows the ultimate negativity of the human condition. And then at the very end of the movie, I'm sorry I'm ruining it for everybody, but her father shows up, and it turns out, it's set in the 30s, and it turns out her father's a huge gangster who's been looking for her, and she's just been on the run, but she's actually very rich. And he's like, so what should I do with the people in this town? And she just thinks for a second, she just goes, kill every one of them. And the last 7 minutes of the movie is literally every single person in the town dying.
Wow.
And it's the most satisfying end of a movie I've ever seen.
Yeah.
It is so satisfying. I mean, I sometimes go back and just watch the ending on YouTube.
You asked for happy crime.
Yeah,
that's
so
what
I was
Ram
just-
I was
just
looking
said
for a
to
happy
you.
ending.
I don't know,
but there is.
that's what I mean. It felt like a happy ending. That's what I meant.
Yeah.
It felt like a happy ending.
Okay, but we've got cozy crime. I mean, like you say, it's a broad church. There's any number. There's a crime for every menu option. So yeah, there's all different shades, all the way up to sunshine yellow.
And you have written your novels based in India. Do you have to know the place well enough to write about it?
Look, this used to be a
Huge
problem.
novels.
This used to be a problem. These days, with Google and all the other tools available to writers, I would never say to any writer, don't use the tools that you have available. For me personally, if I'm writing about a place, I like to have traveled there. Even if I'm writing about small town America in my thriller that came out this year, The Girl in LA, I did a lot of traveling around small towns in America to try and get the vibe, to get the people. With India, it was much easier because I'd lived there for a decade, but I didn't live in 1950s India. So to a certain extent, I was transplanting myself to a period I didn't know. But there's so much research there. And one of the joys of doing historical fiction is that you surprise yourself. You learn lots of things that you don't know. And so my books are sold in lots of places around the world, and I get lots of interesting emails from people who I wouldn't have thought would be interested, especially in America and Australia, people I wouldn't have thought were interested in 1950s India. But at the end of each of my books, I have a couple of pages where I put all of the things that are real, from real history, that I've used in the book. And a lot of that material, people are shocked and surprised by. To give you just two very quick examples, the fingerprint classification system that we use in the West was invented in Calcutta by two Indians. But the name given to it was named after their British superior, whose name was Henry, so it's called the Henry classification system. And then it was taken to Scotland Yard in the UK, and then all around the world. And it's pretty much the same system we use today, but computerized. And the other amazing fact that comes in that appears in one of my books is about Mount Everest, which is named after George Everest, who was a Welsh surveyor in India. But he never went near Mount Everest, and he certainly didn't determine that it was the world's tallest mountain. That was an Indian named Sikdar who did that. But because he was a surveyor in India, and the British Society wanted to reward him for his service, they looked around on their maps, and they found this mountain, which was called PK, because none of the Indian names were good enough, apparently, so it was called PK. So they said, let's name it after Everest. To be fair to him, he didn't ask for the honor. He was quite sheepish about it. But it's those I call it historical correctionism, which I do during the course of these books.
Right. You want to add something, Ram?
Sure. So no, I would just say, for me, I was very nervous about writing about India because I hadn't lived there. And so I deliberately kind of kept most of the action within a hotel. But I also think this is stuff because it was my first time writing a book. I don't really feel like I had the confidence to go do research and like really be able to portray something in an accurate way. So, but I think that might be just something about learning going forward.
Well, no, I would just add that we've had well over 2 centuries of European writers writing about the rest of the world, and it didn't inhibit them in the least. So
They know everything. Coming back to the process of writing, personally for me, when I was writing my first crime novel, writing the climax was the most difficult aspect of, crafting and finishing the novel. Though I knew that what I am supposed to do and how things will fall into place, but still, it took the longest time. And recently, I had this conversation with a very famous filmmaker in India, in Bollywood. And she told me, she said that most of us filmmakers and scriptwriters, screenwriters, we struggle with the climax, crafting the climax. So what she has started doing since last 3 of her films, she says, I write the climax first. This is just an example I'm giving. Do you ever face this kind of dilemma while writing? When you're writing a suspense crime thriller?
So I outline like crazy. So I had a 100-page outline for my book, and I wrote it totally out of order.
Okay.
And I waited to write the conclusion just because like it kept percolating in my mind, and then by the time I wrote it, it was just pure pleasure, and I wrote it in like 20 minutes.
Vaseem, did it ever happen to you that you are stuck with the climax?
No, I spent...
Or any other part?
Not really, because I spent 3 months plotting, and I know exactly what I'm trying to do over the course of those 3 months. I mean, look, I trained as an accountant, right? So, because I wanted to be a writer, but my parents were Asian, and they said, no. They said, no chance, you're not going to study literature at university. I wrote a novel when I was 17 and sent it to agents, but of course it was rubbish, so it didn't get anywhere. But they said, no, you're studying accounts. But I'm glad I did, because that's what took me to India as a management consultant. So I use a spreadsheet. So I plan the whole novel out very carefully, do all the research. I know exactly what's happening where, when, and I know what the climax in. It doesn't mean that it doesn't change during the course of writing, because often it becomes a bit more fluid, and you suddenly decide. So with Midnight at Malabar House, the first in that series, the original killer in my spreadsheet, I decided not to use that one. But because everything was planned and I had all the clues pointing to the various suspects, I could just pivot to a different suspect.
Can I ask, do you write in order?
Yes, very much so. I have a very linear brain when it comes to doing the writing, because I think that's how most readers read. They don't jump to different points in the novel and then jump backwards. They read, especially crime novels, they read in a linear fashion. So I try and make it easy for readers to enjoy a novel. So yeah.
Do you guys use Excel sheets? I've heard novelists using Excel sheets.
I'm a lawyer, not an accountant.
He's definitely an Excel person.
Are you kidding me? I'm actually recoiling in horror / admiration, because I did it all wrong and it nearly killed me. I just, there's the whole thing of who's the boss, you or the characters, and Vladimir Nabokov famously said, my characters are galley slaves. And,
I'm the
not
boss.
that I would never normally quote Nabokov. Anyway, it was the reverse for me. I tried so many different, and I just kept rewriting it. I just couldn't quite put my characters through some of the things that I could envisage. So I just kept going at it again and again and again, and it was deeply painful and horrendous. So maybe I should have tried a spreadsheet.
But the thing is, the characters do have their own voices and their personalities, and sometimes they do take over. And you've clearly found that. And I have two main characters: Persis, who represents India because she went through the independence movement, but she's working with an Englishman, Archie Blackfinch, who's come over from England. He wasn't there during the Raj, but he's now a forensic scientist. And of course, there's a will they, won't they vibe. But how can she have anything to do with him? Because the Raj hangs over his shoulders, even though he didn't participate in. And so what I found as I went through the series is that their relationship grew organically from the page without me planning it. So it does happen, absolutely.
Also, about your journey, because both Vaseem and Ram started as novelists writing fiction. In your case, and also in my case, we've been both journalists writing non-fiction. Your first 2 books were like wonderful pieces of non-fiction. What about the process of writing fiction? How was this for you? Smooth, or was it difficult?
Again,
what
really
was
difficult.
The difference in writing both formats?
Way harder. And I'm conscious, is Rita Chakrabarti in the audience? Yes. So in the previous session, Rita, who's a BBC journalist, was talking about that shift from journalism to fiction. And it's fraught with peril. I grew up as a writer in BBC World Service, which is, you're not even allowed an adjective. Back in the 90s, it was very, very, very dry. So no swerving ever into, celebrity or any kind of exaggeration. It was just incredibly cut back journalism. So then to suddenly sashay over into just making stuff up was pretty preposterous. And it took a while for me to be able to enjoy it, because I felt, even when I was writing fiction, that I still had a sort of burden of truth, and that it should be sort of purposeful and doing something. So it took a long time to just be able to kind of roll around in it and enjoy it. And I'm a huge consumer of fiction and a student of fiction lifelong. But it was a leap. It was definitely a leap to be able to just enjoy the writing and enjoy the process and really let go. So, but it's just hard. It's harder than I thought. Yeah.
It is hard, but I love the image of rolling around and enjoying it. And that's where I start. I started in writing trying to be too serious and writing big literary novels. And I love literary fiction, still read very, very broadly across there. But now I inject a lot of, as you can probably tell, I inject a lot of dry humor because my characters are very serious. Persis takes herself incredibly seriously, which she has to. She's a woman operating in a very paternalistic society. The police force in India in 1950, quite misogynistic. So she has to operate, and she overdoes it probably at times, but I don't think there's anything wrong with that. We're willing to allow our maverick male police officers to get away with a lot of stuff, so I think it's perfectly fine for her to get away with breaking the rules now and again. But sometimes I'll be writing a line which is quite amusing, and I'll laugh at it, and then I'll suddenly realize my wife has just come in, and she'll look at me and she'll say, "Do you realize how sad it is that you're laughing at your own jokes?" So, it is true.
But since you talked about literary fiction, that you read a lot of literary fiction, do you think, and it's an oft-repeated question, can crime fiction be literary fiction?
Let Ram answer.
I would say, of course. For me, I think
Only crime writers say that.
Well, no.
but
It's interesting because Agatha Christie is obviously the best-selling fiction writer of all time. I also think she's one of the best writers of all time, and she doesn't get anywhere near as much credit for the quality of her craft and for the quality of her writing as she should. Obviously, yes, it's very commercial.
I'm really talking about the credit part. Yeah.
So, but I would consider, I would consider her to be the most literary fiction of all. But, yeah.
B, what's your take on that?
I mean, it's just a genre thing. I don't feel very strongly about genres. I think good writing is good writing.
Yeah,
and,
that's what I believe.
Of course, it's literary fiction. I mean, for me, it's obvious.
I think for me, it's there's a lot of snobbery in the publishing industry. We have to be honest about that. Literary writers, non-fiction writers versus genre writers, etc. Romance writers have their own corner, etc., etc. For me, I think I read so broadly. I do like good prose, so I do try to focus on writing good prose. But I think that a good story that resonates with you, and you put the book down, and you're still thinking about it, a day, 2 days, a week later, because of the mystery element of it, or because of the characters resonated with you, I think that transcends all of these characterizations that we make of the genre. That's the most important thing, that a reader should spend that time with you, and by the end of it, they should feel that it was time well spent.
And most of the characters that all of us have written are created by us, but in your case, Vaseem, you're writing a series of mystery novels now where you are reimagining the character of Q, which is from the James Bond franchise, if I'm not wrong. You haven't created this character, right?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. So James Bond was written by Ian Fleming, and they've sold like 100 million books over the years, and of course, it's still one of the most iconic characters in the world. And the Ian Fleming estate had read some of my Malabar House novels, and so they approached me because what they wanted was a series of novels where Q, who is the scientist who helps Bond, and he's the weapons expert who gives Bond gadgets and field technologies, etc. And they wanted a series where he's the lead, solving mysteries in a traditional manner. But they didn't know what they wanted to do with it. And so they asked me, can you think of something that if we ask you to do this? And so I said two things. One, Q is a serious man. He's a serious scientist. And on screen, he became a bit of a caricature. I said, I won't do that. I won't make it too light and fluffy. He has to be a real scientist. He's booted out of MI6. He is licking his wounds, and then he goes to his hometown to solve the mysterious death of his childhood friend, who's a computer scientist, who's a quantum computer scientist. Hence why that first book is called Quantum of Menace. It doesn't come out till October. I've had a lot of fun writing it. Again, there's a lot of dry humor, but at its core, it's about a man who's lost his place in the world, the place that he's had for about 25 years, and yet he's wedded to this notion of Britain, a Britain that is operating in an increasingly fraught world with dangers from across continents. And he and James Bond as well, who never gets enough credit. Nobody ever thanks James Bond for putting his life on the line for his country and for the ideals that his country believes in. And those are the things I try and explore in this book. I've had a lot of fun writing it. I don't know how it will be received. Bond fans are very engaged with their characters. I hope they like my Q. My Q is not Desmond Llewellyn. It's not Ben Whishaw. It's somewhere in the middle. He's 50 years old. But he's a man who hopefully people will take to. As I said, the first one is Quantum of Menace. It comes out in October.
Great, we're looking forward, Vaseem. And coming back to the darkness of Noir, yeah. Why are you choking? Yeah. So, yeah. You want some water?
Yes.
Yes, please.
Do you need some water?
Thank you.
Thanks, I just got a tickle.
Yeah.
As you were.
Coming back to darkness.
Sorry, but will you?
No, I was just asking that coming back to.
It'd be great if
our
someone died on
subject.
stage,
Yeah,
wouldn't it?
yeah. So
That would be
we
dramatic.
while we are creating these dark stories, which are mostly gloomy, we're talking about corruption, crime, murders, and the darkness kind of comes from within the writer, from us. Does it ever take a toll on you personally? Does it affect you?
I mean,
has it ever happened?
when you're thinking about how to kill people all the time, I mean, it can have an effect. I always joke that I would not want to ask my ChatGPT what it thinks of me, because I ask it things like, give me 5 ways someone could die in a scuba diving accident. But it really is like, I mean, yeah, but I think it makes you just see a lot of things in a different way. But yeah, obviously, I think any job that you do ends up having an effect on how you see the world. And it's something that you just can't take too seriously or allow yourself to get too dark about. So yeah.
Extreme thoughts while you're writing a psychological.
No, I mean, what matters is that you, sorry for choking, by the way, but that you care about the world. And one of the writers that had the biggest influence on this particular work is a Yorkshire writer called J.B. Priestley, who was a huge interwar genius. And he's known now for the play An Inspector Calls, which was the inspiration for this. But in the 1930s and 40s, he was very famous as a radio personality, and an extraordinary warrior for social justice, who did radio broadcasts that were intended to boost morale. He was second only in audience reach to some guy called Winston Churchill. His audience was seriously like 16 million. And he is partially responsible for the creation of the post-war welfare state. Such was his influence and such was his dedication to attacking the causes of social inequality. And that's what An Inspector Calls is about. It's a sort of iconic work of British theatre that school kids everywhere, your hairdresser, everyone studied it. It's a very democratic art form. And clearly all of his writing, not just An Inspector Calls, was imbued with this political energy. And so I think if anything, it's a reverse. Rather than being sort of corrupted and depressed by the writing, it's a sort of, it generates energy and it generates a sense of political momentum, certainly for me. And, you know, being able to engage critically with things that are happening in society, with racism and with, you know, history that's only been told from one perspective, whatever it'll be. You know, it's a fantastic thing to be able to do through the medium of fiction. You know, we're really lucky.
And how normal is it to constantly think about different ways to murder a person? How normal is that?
Unless if you haven't seen already, we're not normal people, clearly. Look, I never suffer from that kind of thought. I enjoy every aspect of writing. It was my childhood dream. As I said, I wrote my first novel age 17. I wrote 7 more over 20 years, all rejected. And I used to be, when I was working in India, in those days you couldn't email your submission. So I had to print these big blocks and mail them from India. It cost me a fortune to about 25, 30 agents in the UK, and then wait months for the reply to come back. But because I was so passionate about being a writer, you know, I kept at it. And I was published 11 years ago at age 40, which is, you know, nowadays it's not that old, but it used to be quite old. And so I enjoy every aspect of it. And the only thing that possibly gives me a niggle is when people, and I'm sure you get this as well, when writers write to you, and when readers write to you to pick you up on a mistake you might have made in the book. And I still remember the first one I got, which was for Midnight at Malabar House. Some guy wrote to me and he said, "Oh, dear Mr. Khan, I really, really love Midnight at Malabar. Really love this book. However, on page 87, line 15, you have Persis in a police jeep in 1950, and the jeep has a window. Well, I regret to inform you that in 1950, that model of police jeep did not have a window." And to be fair to him, he was absolutely right. It was my mistake. So I wrote back politely to say, "Thank you very much." Then I wrote to my editor and I said, "Please make sure I never put another window on that bloody jeep." So
In any edition.
I will say, I actually have only done that once for a writer, and it was a writer who...
you were the guy.
But I'll tell you why. So it was a white writer who writes for like a very sort of affluent audience, who I always thought did a very good job of bringing minority characters into her books. And And she had this character who was from Ghana speaking with a French accent. And I wrote to her manager speaking, they speak English in Ghana. Just because it was just the sort, because that was just the sort of thing, it was so well-intentioned, and it was actually a really bad mistake, and they thanked me for it. And they were like, we're gonna fix it in later editions. But I only did it to try to make her
Do you get this, B?
to help her. Yeah.
Not yet.
You're perfect.
That's the only possible
Yes,
explanation.
the perfection. On that note, I think I'll open the house for questions. Are there mics? Yeah, there are. Yeah, thank you.
Hello. Yeah. Hi. This is a question for B. You mentioned that you're a journalist and now you're writing fiction and it's really hard. I'm wondering how hard it is to be a fiction writer and then be a true journalist.
You'd have to ask someone else that question because I don't know. Do you mean moving from fiction to non-fiction?
No, if you move into the world of writing fiction, you're creating things, you know, I mean, and that starts making you really interested. And then to be back to journalism where you're only reporting and just talking truth and facts, doesn't it become boring?
No. The skill sets, I guess, are still there if you've been using them for a long time. And I find all means of communication interesting and important, and all forms of storytelling equally valid. So, and there's just so many stories to be told. So I think there's a case to be made for both forms, you know, for journalism, non-fiction, and storytelling.
Can I add something? If you look closely, in many countries there are journalists who are writing fiction in the name of journalism.
Well said.
Yeah.
I'm afraid this is also a question for B, because I haven't read your books, Vaseem and Ram, and I'm really looking forward to reading them, but I have read B's. And you talked about subverting expectations for the reader, and the one-woman crime wave of the title, the reader is going along thinking it's a particular person, and then that expectation is inverted. And I wondered if you knew that you were going to do that right at the beginning, if that was very plotted, or if it's something that sort of came on you.
Once again, my shambolic processes are exposed. I did not know. I loved the idea of one woman crime wave, and I thought it was kind of great, and I had the character ready. But as I was overtaken by the themes, it did occur to me that she's not the crime wave. So without giving anything away, that was another thing that sort of, so it's almost as if I was in a constant state of catching up with the story and trying to make sense of it rather than blocking it all out in advance. I really must try it your way one of these days, because I'm sure it's a lot.
It's not much more fun.
Look, there's Lee Child, right? So Lee Child is a friend of mine, and he famously says he doesn't do any plotting whatsoever. He gets up the same day every year, he writes one line, the opening line of the book, and then he just takes it from there. And I've had a dinner with him recently, and I quizzed him, and I said, Lee, that's just bullshit, isn't it? You just make that up, right? You know, that's for the cameras. That's not real. He says, no, Vaz, that's exactly how I do it.
No, there are some people who do that. I was speaking to a terrific young crime writer named Charlotte Vassell, who I think is such a good writer, and her books are so well plotted. I was like, so how long did it take you to write? She's like, 6 weeks. And she had like 4-year-old twins. It was wild.
That's not fair.
It was wild.
Lovely. Question? Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody. It's almost as fascinating to listen to crime fiction novelists like all of you speak as like reading a real crime fiction. One of the questions which I wanted was, given today's world where everything crime is so popular on Netflix and the other web series, is that something which is always on your mind when you're crafting a crime novel, that you will get that call where this will actually be made, the book will be converted into a series? Is that ever occurred to you? I was just Googling Ram's book right now, and it says, for all the fans of White Lotus, here is Ram Murali's new novel. So is it something which all of you keep thinking about?
So, I mean, I'll say I'm pretty perverse about this. So I worked in film and TV for a long time. And so as soon as I started writing the book, it was the first question anyone was asking me. And I just got really annoyed by it, because I was just like, it's not like a book's ultimate form is a movie or a TV show. I was like, maybe my book is just happy being a book. So I've actually been pretty, I mean, I have an agent who's looking for right stuff for it, but I've been pretty closed off to it. And another reason why is because the writer of a book whose book gets adapted gets screwed. So you lose all audiovisual rights to the main character. And like, there are characters in my book that are quite autobiographical, and if I sold the movie rights, those producers would have the right to do whatever they want with those characters in any further movie or TV show without even asking me. And maybe J.K. Rowling can negotiate a deal where that doesn't happen. I can't. So probably pretty unusually for a writer, I just kind of haven't sold them because I don't want to give up the control.
I think I agree with what Ram is saying, that if you're writing a book, that in itself is the destination. In my case, the reverse happened, because I had started off writing an 8-episode series, and then COVID struck. So it was like a 4-page detailed plot of a series. COVID struck, and then my editor and I discussed about writing a novel instead. And I'm happy it happened, and it became a 400-page novel. And I'm really happy about it, not thinking about converting it into a TV series or a movie. So I think it is a destination in itself to write a book and to finish a story. That's the most important thing. Vaseem, you want to add something?
Well, my books have been optioned for a decade, and when I first got into the industry, I didn't know anything about it, so I got super excited. And I still remember one of these crazy meetings with the people who'd optioned it. There was a guy who owned, the representative was a guy who owned a whole bunch of restaurants around the world, and he invited me to his Mayfair restaurant. He said, "Oh, put the menu away," and he called the chef up and he said, "You know, the chef's gonna make us something." Then he took out his phone and he said, "Look, I've got all these film stars on my phone, and you just tell me who you want in your book, who you want in the adaptation, and I'll give them a call right now," etc., etc. And then I learned the hard way that's just as you say, it's just nonsense. Very, very few options ever get made. Probably 1 in 1,000 or something of that nature. So the best that you can hope for is that you get optioned, and you just take the money every year that they give you, and then if it comes off, I would be glad. I don't mind giving up certain rights to see the things on screen. With the Q novels, there's probably more chance of those getting made now that Amazon owns the rights to Bond, but we can't say anything about that at this moment in time, so I won't.
So the first book I co-wrote with an Iraqi woman called May Witwit, and it was called talking about Jane Austen in Baghdad, and it was dramatized by the BBC, but into radio. And that was an extremely weird experience, not entirely pleasant. I mean, obviously it's good for sales, so if we're honest, we kind of secretly have a beady eye on, what's the healthy for the book in its onwards life. But interestingly, in Jaipur, a couple of years ago, I interviewed Bonnie Garmus about lessons in chemistry, which had been huge.
What a great book.
And she said, when she signed the deal with Netflix, everyone gave her the advice, sign the deal and then just run far, far away. And she said, that's what I did.
Forget about it.
But it's really, because she and I have the same agent. And so she's been so vocal about how much she hated the adaptation of it and hated the whole process that she was a real reason why I didn't go further with the sales.
All the writers I know hate their adaptations completely. Each one of them.
She was really unusually vocal about how much she hated it.
Well, Lee Child famously wasn't happy that Tom Cruise appeared in. I mean, look, if Tom Cruise wants to play Persis, more than
Tom, if you're out there, he's ready.
More than happy.
Yeah. One last question, I think. If you have the time.
So I've heard that a lot of characters end up writing themselves. They, kind of take on their own lives. So I was wondering, and this question is to all 4 of you, has any of your characters gone rogue and surprised you? Have you ever had such a character?
Why don't you start?
Any character.
Who surprised you yourself that you could write such a character?
Yeah. I think I wrote a father-son story, my first novel, which is like a cop and son story. I think the son surprised me in many ways. I was not thinking, he was not there in most of the chapters. He had a very, I am from television, so I think he had a very small role to play. But he surprised me, and he became one of the lead characters in the story, which I was not planning at all. So yeah, it sometimes happened. it has happened with me.
I think Persis surprises me in every novel because she's a woman and I'm not. And my first series, the Inspector Chopra novels, he was basically me. He was me talking about my experiences through the eyes of an Indian policeman, my experiences in India. But Persis is a woman, and I was quite nervous about writing a woman. Thankfully, it's worked out, and I've just signed to do 2. I've done 5 novels. I've signed to do 2 more. But in each of these books, you were talking about how characters sometimes take on a life of their own, and she does. So she keeps surprising me in ways that I didn't originally plan out in each of these books. So I think that for me is my favorite character that I've ever written.
So I've only written 1 book, obviously, and I think I controlled that process so much from beginning to end that I don't think any of the characters really surprised me in what they did, but I think they ended up surprising me in what they said and how their personalities developed and the way they reacted in different situations. And so that was really fun. But I mean, coming back to the autobiographical element of it, everybody assumes the main character in the book is me, because I always say if there are 2 things that I could do differently, the first is really remove some of the biographical similarities because he's not actually me, and the second is probably not publish it under my name. But too late for both of those things.
I would say yes. My character in One Woman Crime Wave, the 15-year-old girl called Ashley, definitely surprised me, and she kind of grew in momentum in my life. So she starts off bad and kind of gets worse, and some of her behavior is really messy. But I miss her. It's quite weird. She did surprise me.
Yeah, and surprises and characters becoming a part of you. And I think on that note, thank you so much, each one of you, such sharp, profound insights, B, Ram, and Vaseem. It's been a pleasure talking to you and understanding the craft of Noir. Thank you, all of you. Thank you, JLF. It's been a wonderful, wonderful experience and conversation. Have a good evening.